Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Debugged podcast. I'm your host, Medha, and today we have a guest with us, Kelcee Griffis. Kelcee Griffis is a technology reporter at Morning Brew, where she covers what connects us. Before joining the Brew, she covered telecom policy, intellectual property, and the judiciary for Law 360 and Bloomberg Law. Kelcee is a Florida native living in DC with her 15-pound ragdoll cat, Hubert. When she's not tuning into FCC meetings and interviewing experts, you can find her listening to Taylor Swift while she trains for a marathon. Kelcee, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Doing great. This is exciting.
Amazing. So let's just dive right in. So, can you talk us through exactly how you got in the tech policy space and how you ended up becoming a journalist?
Absolutely. First off, I'm really excited to be talking to the debugged audience. I am, if nothing else, I'm a big sister. I have three younger siblings. My youngest sibling is 18, so he's just a freshman in college now, and we talk about technology all the time. So I think it's really fun to keep a finger on the pulse of how different generations are like interacting with technology and how it affects us all like similarly and differently. I got into journalism and specifically tech journalism through kind of I would say like a winding path. I started very early in life with an interest in writing. If you ask my siblings or my parents, they would say, they would tell you about the newspapers that I wrote for my family. I did a newspaper style Christmas newsletter every year that was called the Griffis Times.
That's
That
so
was
cute.
it was really fun. I interviewed family members, including about my dad's kidney stone one year. So, really riveting reading.
Right.
And and then when I was a teenager, I wrote a magazine on Microsoft Word 98 that I sent out to my friends. I collected their writings. We wrote essays. We wrote stories. We interviewed each other for it. It was a ton of fun. And so by the time I was, 16, 17, looking at college options, I think going into journalism was pretty clear cut for me. I knew I wanted to do something with writing, so I ended up at the University of Florida. Another thing that I think sort of shaped my path getting into, kind of the getting onto the journalism path was doing high school speech and debate. I think that's another great entry point if you have an interest in writing, because often writing and speaking go together. So I think that was, another huge influence for me. But by the time I ended up at the University of Florida, I took a reporting class, really enjoyed it, and I started working for the student newspaper. The UF student newspaper is called The Alligator, and it's fully student driven. So we didn't have any adults supervising us. We made a paper every night, 5 days a week. So that was a really formative experience that gave me a lot of hands-on practice with what a day-to-day job in journalism would look like. And by the time I graduated, I knew that's what I wanted to do. So I took a couple local jobs at a trade publication before moving to New York City and taking the job in legal journalism at Law 360. From there, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I am now. I took a job at Bloomberg Law and eventually ended up at Morning Brew.
That's amazing. First of all, I also did high school speech and debate, so love to hear and see another debater doing amazingly. I feel like speech and debate kids are always just so amazing, wherever they end up. And so I'm curious to understand just like why technology out of all topics. I feel like there's so many really cool things that you can report on, and it sounds like you have the skill set to talk about everything. So, how did technology find you, or you find it?
Yeah, so I would say as a person, I am pretty low tech. I'm not an early adopter by any means, but I sort of fell into technology journalism when I was at Law 360. One of my coworkers who covered the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates wireless providers and cable companies and all sorts of big tech players. That coworker was going to be gone for several weeks, and I asked if I could fill in for her. I thought her beat was really interesting, and I wanted some experience in sort of, covering these industries. I was able to do that. I tuned into an FCC meeting online. I got to interview some experts, and I just really I developed a soft spot for this industry. I think technology is always changing and we don't know where it's going. I think it's fun to see the new developments that come out, but also the way that regulators and lawmakers are trying to keep up in regulating and making sure that people stay safe when they're using these new technologies.
And so that's so interesting, and I'm so curious. I'm sure during your time like reporting on tech policy, you've encountered so many different people also pursuing the same career path. Have you like noticed similarities or even differences in the way that everyone else that you've met and encountered has found that field?
Yeah, definitely. I'm friends with a lot of other reporters, and when I go on trips with friends who are reporters, we're always the people on like a tour that are asking questions. Tour guides see us coming from a mile away, and they're like, "Oh no, like these people, these people are going to keep us busy." So I think that there's just like an innate curiosity that makes a good reporter, and a level of comfort in like talking to people. I think I've really sort of gotten to lean in on that personality trait of mine, and it serves me well in this job, and I think it serves a lot of people well. I also think a lot of people, especially who fall into tech journalism, are big readers. I read a lot of fiction. I like nonfiction too, but reading fiction is, one of the ways that I pass my time when I'm not working, and I think for a lot of other reporters, that's true as well. It doesn't always have to be work related to be influencing your job and like how you think about the world, and that's kind of the approach I take when I'm reading at my personal time.
Totally. I feel like constantly asking questions, being curious, and seeking that through literature, and also like mentorship or peers is so important. And that's so cool. That's such an innate trait within reporters as well as tech policy reporters. I think it makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, what has been the most overwhelming or craziest week that you've had as a tech policy reporter? What was that like, and what was the topic that was plaguing your minds?
That's a great question. So back in 2017, I was living in New York at the time, and my company sent me down to DC to cover the repeal of net neutrality. This was
Oh, wow.
during the Trump administration. There was this huge like media firestorm building around this rule repeal. A lot of people, including young people, including middle school and high school students, were involved in the advocacy around this. And it was really exciting to be able to be on site and kind of experience what this like regulatory change looked like in real time. I remember I woke up super early. I took the metro down to the waterfront area of DC, near where their old headquarters was. And I walked up on the scene of a bunch of people milling around. It was cold, so people were bundled up. There were people with megaphones, people with signs. It was like being at a big protest or a rally or something. And everyone was encouraging the FCC to not repeal the net neutrality rules, which is the majority did ultimately repeal the net neutrality rules. But it was really interesting to kind of see both sides of that story. I was in the meeting room later listening to the majority of the Republican FCC commissioners talking about why they chose to repeal the rules, but then seeing those advocates on the sidewalk, telling their stories about why open and free internet access was important to them, really just kind of drove home like the importance of that issue to me. And I thought it was a great look into sort of both sides of that really contentious issue.
That's so funny. And it's so interesting because I was in speech and debate at the time, and net neutrality was one of the topics that we debated. And so I totally agree with you. I mean, I saw that in myself and in my peers. Like, people were so passionate on both sides of the aisle, no matter what their opinion was. And so that leads me to my next question. Does it ever surprise you how passionate people are about some of the policies that you report on, and anything that stood out to you in the past?
Absolutely. There's actually two different FCC proceedings that it wasn't net neutrality that was actually the most contentious. I think that was contentious in a mainstream way, but I was involved in the nitty-gritty of reporting a couple spectrum issues.
Mhm.
Spectrum is obviously the unseen airwaves that carry all communications and enable them as we know them today. And the way that those spectrum bands are divided up and resold or auctioned off or given to public like utility companies is it's a really big issue that involves a lot of money. So two of those fights were over something called the C band and another band that was carved up for educational broadband. And in both cases, regulators were looking at ways that they could maybe use those spectrum bands more efficiently. And I have never been to more tense like public discussions as when I was at roundtables for carving
Mhm.
up these different spectrum bands. I remember at one point during the educational broadband discussion, I looked around to see if anyone else was like picking up on the tension in the room.
Mhm.
These people were sniping at each other in like a public forum. People couldn't understand how you couldn't see their side. You know, if you weren't on their side, you were against them. And that was just something that I never expected to see in something as niche as like a spectrum fight, but it happens.
That's absolutely that's terrifying. And so going to all of these FCC meetings and interviewing experts, is that intimidating? Like, how do you handle that kind of pressure? And do you have a preparation process and all of that? Like, what's your mindset going into these kinds of contentious meetings?
Yeah, it is definitely intimidating, but I think practice makes it so much
Yeah.
easier. I remember when I was interviewing, or I was set to interview the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. At the time, it was Ajit Pai, and that was during the Trump administration.
Right.
Ajit Pai was the chairman who led the repeal of the net neutrality rules. So, in some corners of the internet, he was not a popular guy,
Mhm.
but I had covered him for a long time. I had been in meetings with him. I had asked him questions in public forums, and so I finally had the chance to sit down with him one on one and ask him some questions at a trade show. So I remember walking backstage at this trade show, getting ready to interview him, and I was feeling really nervous because he was a high profile public official. I was going to have to ask him some questions that weren't softballs. They weren't necessarily going to be easy for him to answer, but I still had to ask them. And I remember walking in and thinking, hey, but I did my preparation because I always like to try to connect with the source up front to just to sort of ease the tension and make it feel a little more comfortable, like we're talking person to person. On the plane to Las Vegas, where I was supposed to interview the chairman, I watched The Big Lebowski. That was well known as one of his favorite movies, and it was a movie that he quoted often. So when I got in the interview room, I made a joke about how the rug really tied the room together. And he laughed, I laughed. I thought it was a really nice moment to just ease the tension a little. So I like to do a little research about my sources and make sure I understand them a little bit about their interests, and maybe some like fun topic that we can talk about and like connect on before we really get into the meat of an interview.
That's a really creative approach, honestly, and I think you're totally right. Doing your research and hard work really pays off in the long run. And so you spoke a little bit about connecting with your sources. Curious about how you approach connecting to your readers or your listeners. Like, how do you take technical topics and approach breaking them down and making them interesting for a non-technical audience?
I wish I had a simple answer for you on that, but again, I think it goes back to practice.
Right.
I think you have to really understand a topic before you can sort of break it down and make it sound simple, but making something sound simple comes with a lot of work on the back end to ensure that you understand the topic and to make sure that you're not oversimplifying something to the point that it becomes incorrect.
Right.
And I feel like I've spent probably most of my career kind of refining that art, and I'm still learning it.
That's totally fair and makes a lot of sense. But I think you're right, recognizing nuance in complicated topics and maintaining that nuance when explaining it is totally fair and totally something that's critical. And so I want to shift our scope a little bit and hear about like some of your observations. We talked a lot about some of the cool trends you've seen in the past. Any cool emerging trends in tech policy, or even just tech in general that you think are hot topics and we should be aware of? if you'd like to divulge, of course.
Yeah, well, I can let you in on a secret. I'm glad you asked. I am about to publish a story in a few weeks that talks about exactly this.
Oh
We're
yeah.
looking at the consumer technology that is going to change our lives in the next 5 years. And I can tell you some early findings
Mhm.
of that story.
That's so
One of,
exciting. Okay.
yeah, keep an eye out for it. One of the things that people have been telling me is kind of this trend in how our lives and our homes and the way we connect are going to change is the rise of augmented reality and virtual
Right.
reality. Obviously, those are buzzwords, we're hearing about them everywhere, but there's some really specific applications that can, for example, help people overcome fears in like a clinical treatment setting. One source was telling me that veterans are increasingly turning to AR and VR technology to maybe expose them to a stimulus that would trigger a PTSD response.
Oh wow.
And in a controlled environment through AR and VR, these people can experience that trigger in a very safe way, in a way that they know that it's not real, but it still can help kind of work on those like fight or flight defenses. So I thought that was a really cool application.
That's really interesting.
We're also going to be seeing a new standard of Wi-Fi coming out. That's Wi-Fi 7. It will use faster internet channels to carry that traffic faster. It can carry more traffic. It can enable some of these bandwidth heavy applications like AR and VR. So that's going to be coming out in some of the newer internet routers that will be on the market soon. We're also seeing generative AI, which is another one of those buzzwords. Generative AI is basically a large language learning model's capability of looking at a bunch of data that you give it and spitting out new content based on that data. So one interesting application that a source told me about is a pet camera that uses AI to identify cute moments from your pet's like activities throughout the
Mhm.
day, and then it will send you those cute moments in the form of video or snapshots that you can then share on social media or like share with your friends and your family. So I think that's a pretty fun application too.
Yeah, I feel like there's such a range of the applications. I'm sure the cute moments one, you'll have to try to get a preview, right, for your cat, because that must be amazing. And so my last question for you, is what advice do you have for people that are interested in your career path? And if you have any advice you would give to your younger self, what would that be?
Yeah, I'm going to take that question in two parts. I would say first, if any of your listeners are interested in becoming journalists, I would say write as much as you can. It doesn't matter what kind of writing you're doing, especially when you're early in your career or earlier in your learning journey. It just matters that you're writing. I kept a diary for years when I was in middle and high school. Like I said, I had personal projects where I wrote my family newsletter. I
Hmm.
wrote magazines for friends, and then when I was in college and beyond, I was able to find more like professional writing opportunities. So I think to my younger self, I would say don't self-select those opportunities and say like, oh, I wish I had a higher profile or a more professional opportunity in front of me. Like those will come. I think just getting that practice wherever you can is so valuable.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I would also say for technology in general, if that is an area that you are looking to work in some capacity, I would focus on becoming a well-informed tech user. And that's something that I've been working on in my personal life. I started recently using a password manager because I became aware of a lot of the vulnerabilities that exist online when I'm just using my 123 Hubert password, not a real password.
Right.
Um,
Sure.
but when I'm using something that is made up, you could easily guess it. It's a common string of letters and numbers that opens you up to so much bad activity online. So using a password manager is, I think, just one great example of an easy way that you can become a more well-informed and smarter tech user. I can give you another example. Just a second.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So the other thing that I would mention is in that vein of becoming a more well-informed tech user, I've learned over the last few years that anytime I use a free service or application, I am the product. If I'm not paying for this product, my data usage is paying for the product. So sometimes that's a good thing. When I'm on TikTok, I don't mind giving up some data on my preferences and the videos that I'm interested in order to see more videos and content that I'm interested in. That data usage is okay to me. That's a deal that I'm willing to make. It's a deal I'm willing to make with Google search engine when I'm putting in my keywords and Google consistently gives me recommendations that are more tailored to my interests because it's been collecting that data on me. But when you download other apps, gaming apps especially, you don't know what the privacy protections are in some of these free applications. So I would say I hope your listeners are thinking very carefully about the way that they interact with these applications online and thinking of themselves as the product in some cases.
That's such an astute observation, I feel like, because I've never thought about it that way. If something's free, you are the product. And I think that's definitely a very good learning lesson for myself included. And hopefully everyone listening. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through your career and share such interesting insights about the future of technology as well. We appreciate the preview into your article that's coming out. I love that. But with that, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all we have for this podcast today.